Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. K. Anil Kumar, Assistant Professor, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Today we are going to discuss about the module called Forest Policies and Tribes under paper Tribal Cultures of India. So students, let us see what we are going to learn from this module. First, you will learn about relationship of forest with tribes and its dependency. Second, the forest and tribe relationship during the pre-colonial period. And also, we'll go through various forest policies that are formulated during colonial period and post-colonial era. After this, we'll also discuss about suggestions and measures by different committees, drafts, and reports formulated for forest and tribal link. Now, we'll start with the introduction, that is tribe, also known as aboriginal communities, indigenous people, Adivasi, Janjati, scheduled tribes are residing in forest since time immemorial. There are nearly about 10.4 million tribal people residing on 15% of the total geography of India and constitute 8.6% of the total population of India. Forests and tribes are culturally and traditionally linked to each other. Tribes have been living in the forest ecology and that has shaped their life and the society they presently have. Most of them live in close proximity of forest and depend on the forest for their livelihood and sustenance. Their entire existence revolves around the forest as they evolve in the woodlands and extract prerequisites like clean water, air, food, medicine, shelter, and even recreational retreats from this forest. Now, we'll discuss forest and tribes relationship. The tribes get food from the forest by shifting cultivation and settled cultivation. Apart from picking various edible and herbal roots, tubers, creepers, fruits, leaves, along with this, the tribes extract varieties of minor forest produce from the forest, that includes fodder, grasses, raw material, resins, bamboo, canons, leaves, gums, wax, dyes, and several forms of food including nuts and wild fruits and honey. National Commission on Agriculture in 1976 has classified minor forest produce as fibers and flosses, grasses, bamboos, reeds and canes, oilseeds, then tans and dyes, then fifth gums, resins and oleoresins, leaves. Forests are integral part of tribal social life because its importance is not only economic but also social, psychological and religious. Tribes worship the trees, bushes and animals which dwell in the forests as totem and believe that their gods and ancestor spirits reside in the forest. Pre-colonial period. In the pre-colonial period, that is before the advent of British in India, the forest resources were enjoyed by the inhabitants of the forest as the rural and limited or no interest in the woodlands. As Guha quoted, the waste and forest lands were never attracted the attention of former governments. If you look at the figure in the slide, in most of the cases, three kinds of authorities claimed the right over the forest. First were the village communities who claimed their rights to cut woods, collect produce, graze the cattle, and extend their cultivation into the forest lands. The second category was that of zamindars and other feudal landlords, and the third category was government. Board of Revenue proceedings of 5th August 1871 of Madras Presidency stated that all of them, without exception, are subjected to tribal or communal rights, which have existed from time immemorial, which are at are as difficult to define and value as they are necessary to the rural population. Here the forests are and always have been common property for the tribal people. During East India Company rule, what was the situation of forest, tribals and forest policies? The company period was characterized by a total indifference to the needs of forest conservancy, and a fierce onslaught on India's forests was taking place in the following settled British period. If you see the figure, you will understand that forests were cleaned for revenue purpose, agriculture and commercial exploitation. Thus, the arrival of British and the exploitation of Indian forest resources marked a new phase in the use of forest produce in India. Though free access to the forests for the people was not inhibited, a kind of de facto ownership of forests and wastelands of the country by the state had begun by this time. By the mid of 19th century, British government realized that the forest resources in India were not inexhaustible. A rapid depletion of forest cover was observed, which forced British government to formulated regulations to preserve the forest resources. The early years of railway expansion saw an unprecedented assault on the more accessible forest. Great chunks of forests were destroyed to meet the demand for railway sleepers. No supervision was exercised over the felling operations, and the large number of trees were felled whose logs could not be utilized. In 1856, Lord Dalhousie laid down the definite forest policy, which realized the impact of forest destruction due to huge uses of timbers in railways, and government of India decided to take energetic steps to protect from further destruction the forest that still survival. Now we will discuss forest policies under the rule of British Crown. The forest governance established by the British was authoritarian in nature, which imposed restrictions on the local forest dwellers communities through a definition of forest as a national property for the colonial objectives. These policies required control of forests for commercial purposes and national development at the cost of local forest based livelihood, rights and privileges. Following in the chronological narration of forest policies and management taken by the British and its impacts on the socio-economic lives of tribal people. The Forest Act of 1865. This act was the first attempt in the direction of regulation of forest produces by the forest dwellers and asserting the state monopoly over the forest. The state was empowered to declare any land covered with tree as forest and to regulate it by notification, provided that such notification should be abridge or affect any existing rights of individuals or communities. Thus, social regulated practices of the forest people were to be restrained by law. So, the customary rights of using forest products were transferred as a privileges. The act was applicable only to forests under the control of the government, and no provisions were made to cover private forests. Now we discuss the Forest Act of 1878. This act was more comprehensive than the previous and extended state authority over the forest. This act divided forest into three parts, namely reserve forest, protected forest, and village forests. The act tightened the government's control on forest by prohibiting certain activities like trees passing or pasturing of cattle. But this was not applicable to neighboring forests where right was still in the hands of communities. Through this legislation, by one stroke of the executive pen, obliterate centuries of customary use of forest by rural population all over India. Thus, when we when the colonial state asserted control over woodlands, which had earlier been in the hands of local communities, and provided to work this forest for commercial timber protection, it intervened in the day-to-day life of the Indian villages to an unprecedented degree. Forest Policy Regulation of 1894. The first forest policy envisaged the supremacy of state's interest over the people interest. The sole objective of the policy was administration of the state forest for public benefit, but it imposed restrictions on the inhabitants of the forest and neighborhood of the forest. It was also classified some forests as a minor forest for fulfilling the needs of communities. The commercial value of the forest has prompted the British government to restrict the community use of the forest. This helped the British to augment their revenue, but in the process, the right of tribals has been curtailed severely. Consequently, this colonial forest policy not only alienated them from the forest but seized their forest rights. This policy has made the forest officials to come in the scene and claim the authority to limit and regulate the traditional tribal rights over the forest. Now we will discuss Forest Act of 1927. The India Forest Act of 1878 was amended in the past by different acts of local governments. It was later on replaced by a very comprehensive act called the Indian Forest Act of 1927. This has not only further regulated the people rights over forest but also codified all the practices of forest officials. The forest officials who played crucial role at the grassroots level had direct interaction with the communities. They were very authoritative and used their power arbitrarily and played havoc with the lives of tribal people. Their coercive behavior and abuse of power forced many tribal to leave their native places. The act deleted the reference to communities' rights over forest, which were made in the 1878 Act. Persons were expected to put in their claims over forest lands and forest produce before the forest settlement officer who was to require into their claims. This act has put some control on the shifting cultivation, which was considered as biggest reason of forest depletion with certain special provisions. The gravest consequence of colonial forestry working on commercial and imperial interest was dwindling of customary rights as well as the decline in traditional conservation and management systems. The restrictions of communal ownership of forests by the state severely destabilized the subsistence economy of forest people. It forced many communities to change their occupation, as Sen Gupta in 1988 observed. To compensate for the loss of source of livelihood, tribals have been forced to explore alternative avenues of engagements. So, in the colonial period, the legal and policy instruments transferred the right over forests from communities' hands to government hands. The common property had become the state property, and the alienation of village communities from forest was begun. In 1935, forest was transferred from the union to state list according to the Government of Act 1935. This authority of the state over the forest produces continued even after independence. Now we will discuss briefly about post-colonial forest policies. Among post-colonial forest policies, the main forest policy was National Forest Policy of 1952. The first post-independence forest policy was formulated in 1952 with a realization of maximum annual revenue from the forest in the nation making. This believed all hopes of tribal people by higher regulation on their rights over the forest resources. It followed the lines of colonial policy makers, but it went beyond the infringing on the privileges of the tribals. The private forests of tribals that were not touched in the old policy were subjected to controls under the new one, that is, free grazing was recognized under the old policy, but a fee was imposed on it in the new one. A concession is given relating to shifting cultivation by the provision that should be curbed not by coercion as early but by persuasion. So, the rights which were converted to privileges in the colonial periods were turned to concession in this policy. New policy withdrew the rights over forest land for cultivation, which was provided by the colonial predecessors, and it also started controlling the private forest, which was totally under the control of tribal in colonial period. The old policy did not touch free grazing in forest. The new policy sought to bring it under control. Fees were introduced and grazing was to be kept to the minimum. The forest policy of 1952 of free India was considered worse than its colonial predecessors' policy of 1894, particularly for the indigenous people. To analyze the forest policy and its impact on the tribal of India, the President of India constituted a commission under the chairmanship of Union Debar, the Scheduled Area and Scheduled Tribe Commission, emphasized the importance of forest in the life of the tribal people in providing them with all kinds of food, that is wild game and fish, wood for construction of houses, and even income from the sale of forest produce besides fuel, and criticize the gradual extension of government authority over forests to detriment the tribal life and economy. It also noted the gradual changes in the rights of the tribal communities over the forest and its transformation from rights and privileges in 1894. Then the rights and concessions in 1952. Thereafter, it remained as concession. The Commission recommended that the policy of 1952 should be reconsidered and tribal should be allowed to cultivate forest lands. The requirements for grazing and shifting cultivation should be considered. It also noted responsibilities of forest officials. The recommendation on National Commission on Agriculture 1976. The recommendation made by the National Commission on Agriculture 1976 was disastrous from tribal's point of view. It recommended a drastic reduction in the people's rights over the forest and forest produce and advocated the commercialization of forest at all cost, ignoring the sustenance of forest people derived from the forest. The Commission recommended the regularization of forest dwellers' rights over forest produce and stated the production of industrial wood should be the reason retire for the existence of forest. Actually, it is in this value that many other values that have been claimed or coerced for forests so far that can be observed. Report of the extreme conservationist approach toward the forest and forest produce and considered tribal and forest dwellers as destructive agents. The local people were considered as destructors of the forest as they extract natural resources at free of cost and contribute less in the maintenance of the forest. It recommended strengthening the forest legislation by changing the forest policy and bringing an uniform forest laws so that incompatibility in forest laws among the states is removed and there is no multiplicity of legally sanctioned authorities concerned with forest matters. It is also recommended that the functionally all forest lands should be classified into protected forest, productive forest and social forest. The 1976 Act, the forest subjected was brought into concurrent list through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment empowering Center to make laws. Forest Draft Bill of 1980. Based on recommendations of the NCA, that is National Commission on Agriculture 1976 Act, provisions were made in a bill to reduce people's rights over forest lands and produce. The government was empowered to declare any land whatsoever to be the forest land. The Act prohibited the state governments from declaring any reserve forest or any portion as unreserved and also from allotting any forest land for any purpose without prior permission of the central government and also made special provisions against the rights of forest people. So, the central government reserved all rights over forest and forest produce with it. The bill later passed by Parliament and become an Act. Committee on Forest and Tribals. To achieve a coordinated policy, the Government of India constituted a committee in 1980 to suggest guidelines for the reorientation of forest policy to serve the forest economy under the chairmanship of Dr. B.K. Roy Burman in 1980. He is an eminent anthropologist. Committee submitted its report in 1982 with emphasis on the importance of forest in the tribal life. Committee noted that tribal rely on forest for not only their basic needs like fuel, fodder and wood, but they also earn one third of their income from the sale of minor forest produce. The committee felt that the national forest policy should recognize the importance and positive role of inhabitants in the maintaining forest, which was only long run solution to question of afforestation, preservation, protection and management of lands. Since the committee was more focused on the tribal economy, it more emphasized on the forest industry and minor forest products, but also gave valuable inputs on the importance of forest in tribal life. The committee pointed out that the benefit should flow to the tribal people through the forestry conservation program and recognition of their forest skills. The policymakers should consider the individual, community as well as national interest angles during the policy formulation, and the basic needs of tribal should not be hampered during formulation as well as implementation. Later in 1995, the Department of Forest was transferred from the Ministry of Agriculture to the newly constituted Ministry of Environment and Forest, which drafted the National Forest Policy resolutions approved by the Parliament in December 1988. Forest Act 1988. If you see the figure, you can understand the basic objective of this act. It is environmental stability, maintenance of ecological balance and atmospheric equilibrium. So, the basic objective of the Forest Act 1988 stated the principal aim of forest policy must be to ensure environmental stability and maintenance of ecological balance, including atmospheric equilibrium, which all vital for sustenance of all life forms, human, animal and plant. The derivation of direct economic benefit must be subordinated to this principal aim. The concept of joint forest management evolved in this act. While this policy has more people-oriented provisions, it still has the concept of exclusive state ownership of forest and mentioned industrial needs as national needs. The practice of shifting cultivation was permitted for a period of 3 years. Special provisions were made to prevent encroachments on reserve forest with punitive measures. State was allowed to constitute village forest except reserve forest. Provisions are made to regulate trespassing of cattle in reserved, protected and village forest, and penalties for such offences have been made very severe. The resolutions had a special provision on tribal people and forest. It is stated that having regard to the symbiotic relationship between the tribal people and forest, all agencies responsible for forest management should see that the tribal people are closely associated in the protection, regeneration and development of forests so as to provide them gainful employment. Now we will discuss the major act and policy of forest and benefits of tribal people, that is the Forest Act 2006. The Forest Act 2006 is a landmark law in the evolution of government's attitude towards the tribal community. After Honorable Supreme Court decision in 2004, the Parliament has enacted the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Act 2006 to undo the historical injustice suffered by tribal communities throughout colonial and post-colonial period. The purpose of this act is to recognize the rights of forest dwelling communities and to encourage their participation in the conservation and management of forest and wildlife. The encroachers were considered as an important agents of conservation and management of the forest and wildlife. The bill has identified the forest dependent scheduled tribes and non-tribal forest dependent tribal people and made a distinction between two on the grounds of sustenance and commercial purpose. No doubt, law has provided a dignified status to tribal, but it will not be able to resolve tribals' human rights and livelihood issue without similar or greater advancement in law and administration in other areas such as land acquisition, development induced displacement, and political autonomy. So, students, let us see what we have learned in this module. As you know, we have learned about tribes and forests, their relationships, and the introduction of invention or intervention of many forest policies among the tribal life. So, the colonial and post-colonial forest laws considered the tribal as destructor of the forest and wildlife. These laws always regulated tribal rights over the forest produce and forest lands. The British has triggered the commercialization of forest product in a disguised national interest and confiscated most of the rights over the forest. The tribal who were enjoyed the forest from time immemorial had no clue but to surrender against the mighty powers. This forced them to alienate the forest and come out from their ancestral home. They were dependent on the mercy of the colonial rules for their sustenance and livelihood. These miseries were aggravated by their own Indian rurals who banned them to access the forest resources and used to commercial profit in the name of nation building and developments. The control has been transferred from communities to the corporate sectors that are making profit by using these resources. In spite of this, the destructor and encroachments are the tribals only. The indigenous people struggle for autonomy and identity throughout the colonial and post-colonial period demanded state recognition of the integrity of their culture and nature. As far the tribes are concerned, the forest is inseparable from their existence. The tribal and forest policies of state could not framed on incompatibility premises. However, this demand was never honored by the state. Tribal people suffer from physical displacement mainly because the laws that do not recognize communal customary rights of people to forest lands. The eviction of millions of tribals from their natural habitat is not solution to the problem of deforestation and degradation. The focus should be on delegating rights of forest dwellers who are the only people who can become good stewards of forest resources through their traditional conservative knowledge. Government and our policy makers should not ignore the importance of tribal and rights be given to the latter No doubt, the Forest Act 2006 has given a way of hope, a ray of hope to the tribal for getting the rights over the forest land and resources. But a proper implementation is demanded to implement this act. Thank you.